I'm Tony Shepard, 30 years tracking organized retail crime and working major busts.
And I'm Johnny Custer, 30 years turning loss prevention into a profit-driving powerhouse with analytics and strategy.
Every episode, we break down the latest in retail risk, security, and total loss prevention. What's real, what's hype, and what's coming next.
And yeah, we'll probably have some fun along the way.
Welcome to It's Your Loss with Tony and Johnny. Retail crime, retail loss, the future of loss prevention.
Hi, welcome to the inaugural episode of It's Your Loss. I'm Johnny.
And I'm Tony.
Hi, Tony. Welcome to our first podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, in our first podcast. Are you prepared for this conversation?
Not really, but we're going to do it anyway.
I think people think we're going to argue.
I think that may happen.
Why do you think that's the case? I mean, it's not like we have complete philosophical differences on the same industry, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it an argument. I would call it debate. We might debate a little bit because we have differences of opinion on things.
That's fair.
It wouldn't call it an argument.
Well, for those people that don't know us, or maybe haven't heard this story, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about your background and kind of what your viewpoint and how you form that viewpoint, and then I'll do the same, and maybe we'll find some common ground there somewhere in the middle.
All right. Yeah, sounds good. So I started out, I think, similar to you, Johnny, as a store detective way back in the day at a company called Montgomery Ward. For some folks on the call may know who that is. But
what was Montgomery Ward, Tony? What was that? I don't remember. I remember a lot of folks that I knew, a lot of the legends worked there, but I was never familiar with the store format.
It's like, I'm trying to think of a company today. It's so like a department store, but also has appliances. I guess kind of almost like a Walmart, really, now that I think about it, which is odd. I never thought about that before. But yeah, kind of like a Walmart, but before, Walmart was a Walmart, basically. I think a lot of folks got started with Montgomery. There's a few companies, as you know, that a lot of folks started out as store detectives at. And again, I started out as a store detective and just moved up through the changes, like a lot of folks in LP, worked at a lot of different companies. But most of the time I was on, I would call the investigative side of LP, right? So dealing with internal theft, external theft, etc. I had spent a little bit of time in more LP operations, or even operations in general, for a short period of time as well, but mostly investigative side, which I know is a little bit. I think that's kind of where our two opinions may have formed.
Well, let me ask you to back up a little bit. So I know that you are a proud veteran, and I know that you've served our country. And immediately after, did you have aspirations to get into this field immediately? Did you want to go into law enforcement? I mean, how did you end up in LP?
Yeah, great question. So I actually wanted to be a private investigator, and I had no idea what LP was.
Okay.
I had no idea. Never heard of it. And was going to school for criminal justice, and somebody from my biology class, not a criminal justice class, biology class, said that I needed a part-time job, and he recommended being a store detective. And I had no idea what that was. And he basically described it as you get to detain shoplifters. That was really the whole job, is the way he described it.
Now, what was the training like at that point? Because I remember the training I went through when I first got to Kmart, and it was pretty intensive.
Yeah, so it wasn't that intensive, quite frankly, at Montgomery Ward, or maybe I missed the training. I'm not really sure, but I didn't really get a whole lot of training. It was hey, there's folks stealing, and we're going to go detain them, and obviously this is a different time, and we carried handcuffs, and you physically restrain people. And
did you have badges?
Of course we had badges.
Yeah. You know it's an old time program if you had badges.
Yep, absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah. But yeah, so we can go into more detail later, but if you want, let's turn it over to you for a second, because I know, I believe you started out similar, but then maybe branched off into some other things LP related, but why don't you go ahead and shoot?
Yeah, I took a wild left turn somewhere, and actually it was right around the same time you and I met, and I don't know if you realized that that's what was happening, but I was essentially in a chrysalis, going from a caterpillar into a beautiful butterfly. All being formed by the management team that we had at that organization, which I'm sure we'll bring up later on. But I started the same way. My only difference is, and I've told the story 1,000 times, so I won't get into too much detail, but I happened on loss prevention by accident. I was supposed to be a cop. Everybody in my family was a cop. It was just the way it was. So much so that my parents put me into what's called an explorer program. It was basically a division of the Boy Scouts, which actually, funny, I'll have to tell you about my daughter who's going through that right now and how much times have changed. Back then, we really were relegated to, we were kind of like special officers. We were like security guards. We directed traffic. We had our little explorer badges, and we learned about writing tickets, wrote a lot of parking tickets. We pulled a lot of people over for, one headlight, one tail light. So I got an opportunity to write tickets for things that most people don't get tickets for. I felt bad because some of these people were getting pulled over just so I had practice writing tickets. But too bad for that. Then I ended up getting the opportunity to go on a ride along, which I thought was the coolest thing ever. I had to wear my little uniform, and if we went on a call, I was required to stay in the car and all kinds of other things. I had to go through all the training on it. But anyway, long story short, ended up getting a call from TJ Maxx at the time. It was about a mile and a half down the road, and they had a shoplifter apprehended. So we end up heading in that direction. We didn't turn on the lights or anything exciting like that, which I was pretty disappointed about. We rolled up, and as we're pulling around the corner, the guy is standing on the corner smoking a cigarette. And there's nobody else around. Guy's got long hair. He's got earrings, got ripped up jeans. I mean, the guy he's obviously a bad guy. So I'm looking at the officer. I'm going, why is he just standing there? Why is he not running? And where's the guy that called us? Turns out that was the guy that called us. This guy, who looks like Bon Jovi, is dressed up in this whole outfit, this whole getup. He's outside smoking his celebratory post-apprehension cigarette. And his buddy, his partner, was in the room with a witness holding on to the shoplifter. Blew my mind. Thought this was the coolest thing I'd ever seen in my life. So I got to talking to him while they were processing the shoplifter, and he's telling me about all the stuff that they do, hiding in the camera or hiding under the racks and hiding in shopping carts and putting in cameras and two-way mirrors. That was it. 14 years old. I was just in love. So immediately out of high school, they had just started opening Walmarts up north. This is when Walmart finally crossed the Mason-Dixon line, and I got an opportunity to work at Walmart as an operator. Was a department manager for electronics, but they had a safety and loss prevention team, and they were training us on, Walmart philosophy for loss prevention, which really was not apprehension focused. It was mostly preventative and a lot of paperwork stuff, some of the stuff that I'm sure we'll be getting into later. But then Super Kmart opened up about 2 years later, working for Dan Faculty and that whole legendary team over there. Ben Guffey was the head of loss prevention. And I started to inquire because I had never seen a super center before, and I was fascinated to have a store that was twice the size of the ones I was working in. And when I got there, they took me back to the camera room. And dude, let me tell you, it was the Sensormatic VM93 system. And I'm sure that means nothing to most of our audience, but for me, it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. All black and white. The room was filled with 20 monitors. Then we had the multiplexer monitors, which allowed us to see all of the still cameras all at once. And we were on a time-lapse VHS recorder that we had to go in and change the tapes every morning and every night, right? Yeah. You remember all that?
Of course, yeah.
But I was hooked. So they hired me to come in and learn how to apprehend shoplifters. $3.70 an hour. I was going to be a millionaire.
That was way more than me, by the way. My first store detective was $3.35. I still remember. $3.35. You were making more than me. Yeah, $3.35.
Out there, getting beat up, getting stabbed, getting shot at, getting yelled at for $3 an hour.
Yep, good times.
All right, let me accelerate the story. So, fell in love with catching bad guys. Just loved catching bad guys. Was looking back now, me of today would have fired me of then probably 48 or 49 times over. If there was a rule, I probably broke it because, and look, this speaks to a lot to our philosophy, right? We were completely judged and reviewed on our numbers. Do you remember the average hours per apprehension statistic that we were all judged on?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, was that? When did that become a thing for you?
That was early on. I mean, again, for the first couple of years I was in loss prevention, it was, to your point, it was all about the statistics and the apprehensions. And I do remember those days.
We had kind of an interesting scoring mechanism, so to speak, at Super K. We would assign case numbers for each type of theft incident that we had. We had prevention techniques, and a prevention, if you remember, was when we didn't have all of the 6 elements required to capture the shoplifter. So we would try and deter the theft and try and get the bad guy to drop the product, right? And
Right.
those were 1,000 series. And we would have a chart with everyone's name up on the wall. And we would show how many preventions they had, how many apprehensions they had, how many internal cases they had, and if they had any bad stops, which was really bad. But you could tell by looking at that, based on the way the data, and I'm saying data now, but based upon the way the numbers were stacked up, you could tell a lot about who the people were that were working for you, right? The ones that had very few preventions but had a ton of apprehensions, they were the cowboys. The ones that were the opposite, they were the ones that were afraid to pull the trigger. And then you had the folks that had no external but were really good on internals. And I thought that was awesome. But if you looked at my numbers, I had a ton of apprehensions and I didn't have anything else.
Yeah, I was very much focused on the external as well. I remember I was fresh out of the Army too, so I was probably in slightly better shape than I am currently today. So I was very much into the apprehensions at the time. Yeah.
And then we had, were you, what was your apprehension physicality limitations? What did they tell you were allowed to do and you weren't allowed to do back then?
Yeah, God, Johnny, it's so long ago. I know, I don't know what they said. I know what I did, which may not have been the same thing as what they said, right? I mean, my first apprehension, actually, or attempted apprehension, the guy actually did pull a knife on me, which is ironic because, again, I was fresh out of the Army, best shape of my life, and my first attempt at apprehension, I was by myself. I don't even think I was actually authorized to make apprehensions yet because you had to, finish something, I didn't actually, I wasn't because I didn't have my badge yet. I didn't have my badge. So I wasn't authorized, but there was this repeat offender. We didn't call him that back then, but there was a guy that would come in repeatedly, and I just happened to see him. I was in that camera room, like you said. I don't remember the system, but the same thing. The entire room's filled with cameras, VCI. It was the coolest thing ever. You get little toggles on the cameras and everything. And
Did you have the joysticks or the pads?
We had the joysticks.
Okay. Click, 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 click.
Yes. And I see this guy peeking in the window, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the guy. They had shown me videos of him previously because he had hit so many times, and I didn't know what I was doing. I just went out running towards that door. It was on the other side of the store, and went to physically restrain him, and he pulled a knife, and I became a little agitated at that, and and then I still tried to restrain him, even though he had the knife. Obviously, not smart. Certainly, when you look back on things nowadays, you wonder.
Did you get cut?
No, I did not. But I did get drugged because I reached in the car after him and got a hold of the coats he was holding, and then the car started driving because there was a second person driving the car. This is on Michigan Avenue, by the way, in Dearborn.
Wait, just to be clear, you got drug in the car. You didn't get drugged as in you took a puff of something while you were going. Okay.
No, I got drugged by the car. I was holding the coats. The car started moving. I started running. I was pretty fast then, but not as fast as the car. Eventually, the car was faster, but I wouldn't let go. And then he finally let go, and I went backwards with the coats. And I was still very proud of myself because I recovered the coats, but I was upset that I did not make that apprehension. But ironically enough, in my warped mind back then, that was when I was really hooked. That was, I came from the Army. It was exciting. That was an exciting time. And so I was, again, I got called in the office that Monday, and the regional manager, let me know that was not the right thing to do, and in a roundabout way. Although, ironically enough, then I received my badge shortly thereafter. So whatever I did wrong apparently wasn't wrong enough that I wasn't given the authority to actually make apprehensions after that. But yeah, just like you, you look back, and it was a different time. It was a crazy time, and yeah, dangerous. But I don't think we realized how dangerous it was when you're in the moment, I guess.
Yeah, at that time we had to the edge of the parking lot. To the edge of the parking lot, we could hold with reasonable restraint. Those were our border or our guidelines.
I think ours was the sidewalk. I think you weren't supposed to go off the side. I think, again, not that was a rule that was necessarily followed, but at the time I'm pretty sure it was the sidewalk was actually the line that you couldn't cross, or that you weren't supposed to cross.
Yeah. And I look back and I see a lot of really stupid decisions, and probably even stupid for that time period. But
Yep.
I think the world has changed so much since then. I can't even imagine doing it. Look, if I'm being honest, I give the folks that are going out making apprehensions now a lot of credit. They're short staffed. We at Super Kmart, I'm not exaggerating here. We had 548 hours per week of loss prevention. It was loss control at the time of loss control staffing. We had 2 people in a camera room. We were sending 3 people out at a time for apprehensions. We were always outnumbering the bad guys. I didn't like that
Yeah, no,
today.
we were very, very similar. I mean, you mentioned, I assume that because you mentioned a board where you're tracking things, which clearly there was several people on the board, right, of the tracking. But yeah, you're right.
Yep.
In today's day, that is definitely not the case. I mean, obviously, as you know, a lot of companies don't make apprehensions, or if there's any type of aggression, they have hands-off policies, which I'm not. I mean, I think that again, there's obviously nothing in the store that's worth anybody getting hurt over. Clearly, again, we were call us young and dumb back then, but yeah, it's very different. And the staffing, to your point, is some of the same. If any of those locations were still open today, they might not even have store detectives or LP specialists, whatever the terminology they would use. They might have an LP manager maybe, and that's it. They don't. The staffing's not like what it used to be. Certainly.
So looking at that foundation, and I think that where we were formed, our childlike years in the industry, I think that that's where a lot of our development came through and kind of turned us into who we are today. And I can see seeds planted early on how I ended up in data. And I hate math, so we'll talk about that another time. But the Walmart training really got me thinking about more operational causations of shrink because we weren't making apprehensions, right? So as a department manager, I had to make sure that when I did a price change, I had to count every single item in the store to make sure that we took the appropriate markdowns or the appropriate markups. Everything was very manual. But I fundamentally understood the impact I was having on the business by taking those additional steps. And then it's funny, I end up at Super K and they think because I had loss prevention on my resume, my limited resume at the time, that I had experience making apprehensions. I didn't. So my second day, a guy stuffs a fishing rod all the way down his pants and it's sticking out his neck. And I'm going, what do we do? And my supervisor at the time was like, well, go get him. No training. And Super K had some pretty intensive training, but she trusted me. I go out and I said, excuse me, I need you to come back in the building. He said, no. I said, okay. Have a nice day. I didn't know what to do. Do you dive on him? What do you do? So my first apprehension was not an apprehension at all. It was just me being made a fool of.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I actually didn't have that. To your point about the data, so I was at Ward's, and interestingly enough, Montgomery Ward, they had the LP department was very big into auditing back then, and they had like this very extensive audit where you audited like every department. So you're going through and auditing the appliances and things like that. And I understood obviously the impact in general, but it wasn't like statistics like you're saying where you could see that was going to prevent margin erosion or shrink or whatever. And I was always, to me, I never got too far from the investigative side because maybe not necessarily because I realized that was going to make the most impact, but that was more what I enjoyed doing.
yeah,
And so I was hesitant to delve too far into the data piece. Yeah.
well, I like the apprehensions because there was that, look, I always described our job as 37 hours a week of complete boredom, staring at cameras, trying to find something to do with your life, and interrupted by 3 hours of adrenaline, fear, and fun. And that was
Yeah.
basically your 40-hour work week, right? So I had no understanding of what shrink or margin was beyond what Walmart taught me. Kmart was big at really instilling shrink, 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 book inventory versus physical inventory. We need to mitigate this number. Nothing about margin, nothing about sales. It's go after the shrink number. And at that time, the famous pie chart that we all get for training was external theft is this chunk, internal theft is that chunk, and operational is just this little bit. So it was all theft. It was all theft, all bad guys. And I didn't really start to alter my opinion a little bit because in external cases were a lot of fun. In internals, they took a lot of work. We were having to go and pull journal rolls out of the cash registers or go up to the
I
attic. And
remember those days. Yeah. Good
do you remember the
times.
bags? Bagging up the journal rolls.
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
What was your first exception-based reporting tool like? I could tell you what mine was.
I don't remember which one it was. I don't know when. I'm trying to think of what company I was at when I actually had a first exception based reporting. I don't know.
Yeah, well,
Let
mine
me
was
get back to
me.
that one. I got to think about it. Which one? What was
Mine
it?
was me going through refund slips at the end of the night and
Oh
trying
yeah,
to
yeah.
figure
Of
out
course, it
which
was
ones had
manual. I
receipts
thought
and
you were
which ones
actually
didn't.
asking me like
Yeah.
what, and I don't remember what it was. But yeah, no. Of course, you were the exception. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when did you get a flavor for internals? As you because I think that's the next evolution that we all take, right? You go from externals,
Yeah,
and then
you
you
go
start
from
to
external.
really understand.
Yeah, I would agree. I think internals are next. I think that to your point, a lot of it was just, some of it was just your gut instinct, right? You think, just so and so just acts odd, and then to your point, you start reviewing. It's a lot of manual reviews. I remember the journal tapes, and obviously one of the dead giveaways was when you had like missing tape, right? So you'd have like a journal tape, and it would end at this transaction, and then like three transactions later, there's the other roll, and you're like, okay, well, clearly something is not adding up here.
Wait, what was that? Wait, so let me think about it. So what was happening? Was somebody cutting out the bad stuff and then creating two journal rolls for that same register?
Yeah, yeah. Imagine that. Imagine that. Yes,
Wow.
yes, yes. So that was a creative way to eliminate any evidence of the transactions. But I don't know if that was. I guess that probably was at Montgomery Ward, but it wasn't until I got promoted to be an LP manager, my first salary job. Actually, I was in Detroit at the time. Got off. I just got my associate's degree in criminal justice. Offered my first salaried LP manager job to work at Montgomery Ward in Nashua, New Hampshire. Never been to the Northeast. I remember the amount though, just like I remember the $3.35 an hour. It was $23,500 a year, and
Holy
there's
cow,
no
man, you were
state
rolling in
tax.
it.
No state tax in New Hampshire, by the way. So I was, I hit the big time in my mind.
Good
I
for
hit the
you,
big
man.
time, and I relocated to New Hampshire. And I think that's when, because again, at that time, it was a lower volume store. I didn't have a staff. Certainly, we had external activity, but not to the extent that I had in the store I was in Dearborn, Michigan. And so I think it was at that point where I probably started delving. I remember having a lot of internal cases at that first location. So it was probably when I started, being more interested in the and maybe I think at the time too, you're talking about that short term adrenaline rush, right? With an internal case, you obviously you've got to dig, right? So you've got to
Yep.
put the puzzle pieces together, and so that's exciting, right? But it's not the 10 minutes of excitement of a shoplifter. It could be several hours or even multiple days trying to, and of course, back in the day, putting in the covert cameras, which was a little bit more challenging certainly than it is today.
We
So
could fill up an entire episode with stories of trying to fill in cameras and climbing through ceilings and throwing footballs and driving radio control cars over ceiling tiles, I'm sure.
yes, yes, most definitely. Yes.
Stuff that folks of this generation are never going to understand.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because I know that it's ironic, obviously, that we now both work at Think LP, right? A software platform, and but we both obviously grew up in the industry, and it's ironic because the tools that folks have now compared to what we have are like night and day. But then obviously we also, because we're on the solution provider side, you hear about that they want these additional things, right, to make things easier. And of course, we want to provide those. But internally in my mind, I'm always like, wow, man, I remembered when, I did a stint at a discount store chain for a couple of years, and we didn't have cameras. I mean, period. We just didn't have them, right? Actually, we didn't even have safes. No, I think we didn't have safes. The money was locked in a filing cabinet. So it is interesting that, and I'm not, obviously things have changed for the better. I just think it's ironic that people now are like, oh, I wish I had X, Y, Z, and I'm like, oh wow, if you had any idea of how challenging these things were before,
Yeah.
we've come a long way for
So
sure.
you went from a camera store to a non-camera store?
Yes.
Yeah, I had that same thing. So in my first salaried position, I was an assistant manager with Super K. And then I was offered, they were creating something they called an urban district, which was inner city Cleveland, inner city Youngstown, Pittsburgh, Detroit, etc. All these regular Kmart stores. I didn't know what I was walking into. All I know is that they decided to give me $12 an hour. I guess it wasn't salary. It was $12 an hour though, which, my God, I'm a millionaire. And they send me to this store down on East 56th Street in Cleveland. I know that probably doesn't mean much to you, but I get down there, and as I'm walking in the store manager and the assistant manager are walking down the main aisle. It's like walking into the 1970s, because Kmart never updated any of their tile or their fixtures or anything.
Oh,
and
I
they're
remember
smoking cigarettes as they're walking through the front. And even then, you didn't smoke in the stores. So these guys knew no one would ever come and check on them. So they were smoking and walking and talking. As I get in, they tell me, welcome. Hey, by the way, our regular shoplifters back there huffing spray paint. This is my entry into the store. I go back there, and just like the movie Mad Max, this guy's whole face is chrome. He's got a paper bag, and he's sitting in our hardware aisle just huffing spray paint. I'm going, my God, where did I end up? Where did I end up? Didn't last there very long because it was a nightmare. But back to internal cases. So I got a flavor for it, not because it was a lot of fun. Originally, it wasn't. It was a pain in the butt going through all the journal rolls and pulling all this stuff together. But we weren't allowed to do or take out internal cases until we were certified. And that meant we had to go to this thing called Wicklanders-Lowski.
Very familiar.
And this was 1994, 95-ish, right? So I was waiting for my certifications, but I got to sit in on some of the conversations, and I watched as the interviewer got this person over the course of 30 or 40 minutes to tell them their deepest, darkest secrets. And I saw the art form. And I was like, holy cow, that's amazing. And then the adrenaline changed for me, right? It wasn't that immediate gratification I wanted. I wanted to put all the work in and just to experience that moment. And at the time, they were calling it assumptive questions. I know things have changed a little bit. But when that assumptive question came out, which was basically the first time you throw that accusation out,
yeah,
the adrenaline from that was like nothing I'd ever seen, because you don't know if they're going to bite. And you don't know if you're going to have to redirect and go through all of that. Fell in love with it, Tony. Absolutely fell in love with it.
Yeah, no, the internal case definitely, it was. I obviously, again, I just left the practitioner space like 3.5 years ago. So for me, it wasn't that long ago that I was still dealing with some of those things. And I think that obviously I definitely enjoyed the interviewing piece, and certainly got a lot of experience with it. When you don't have cameras and you have no evidence whatsoever, and you're trying to figure out what happened to cause this store to lose 100,000 or 200,000, certainly you with training, obviously, which of course I've been through Wicklanders-Lowski several times in my career, but you do obviously get very good. It's anything you're going to do, right? You're going to get good at it. I mean, heck, even professional shoplifters, they do it all the time. They get good at it, right? I mean, that's what you do. And so I did, because of all that experience of having no evidence, I got really good at it. But I also did enjoy, I know you mentioned that it's, the time consuming part and it's a drag and all that. And I agree with you. Certainly it was. But to me, it was putting that together. It was like putting the puzzle together, trying to understand what they were doing, what other method, obviously when someone's stealing, typically they're not doing one thing, right? Like what other methods are they doing? And so it wasn't just the interview part for me. It was the just putting the pieces together of that puzzle. I found, I really enjoyed that. And to your point, not to say I didn't get aggravated when it took forever sometimes, but yeah.
But now you're speaking my language, and this is what I want to explore right here, because at some point we went and we veered off in two different directions. I mean, we both understand each other's mentality, and I completely believe in your philosophy. It's just I do it a little bit different. That's all.
Right.
But
sure.
So at Kmart, we had the weirdest rule from an internal standpoint. You were not allowed to interview an internal candidate until you had 3 incidents on video.
I never worked at Kmart, and I'm very familiar with that because I worked with people that came from Kmart, and that to me, I never was at a company that had that. So for me, it was very odd because again, I didn't have cameras in a company I worked at, right? So of course I couldn't have 3 video. And I thought on the one hand, I'm like, well, gosh, that means like, okay, so you have somebody one time, you can't just, I mean, of course they're doing like, I'm familiar with that policy, but I never worked at Kmart, ironically enough.
And I will tell you, I think that stagnated my skills and the skills of everybody that was involved with that for the time that we were there. because you were having to put a lot more mental work into it and actually have to fine tune your interviewing skills to make sure that you can get that admission. Where we had 3 dead bang on video. What do you need to interview? I mean, I pretty much just walk in and throw a videotape on the counter and say, here, sign this.
Right, right. Yeah, no, yeah, that's a valid point. I think that, you've made it so, the interview is not so challenging when you've already got, heck, if I had any incident on video, I thought it was a slam dunk. But to have 3, or required to have 3 prior to, that certainly makes the interview process a lot easier for sure.
When I ended up at that regular Kmart with the manager smoking, I was there for a few months. And again, I went from 548 hours a week just down to me making the apprehensions. I didn't last long. I just wanted out. I just felt I didn't feel safe. But I ended up working for a company called Value City Department Store. And this is where things started to change for me. Value City was basically, I don't know if you're familiar. You're from... Yeah, well, you're from Detroit.
Detroit, I am familiar with.
Yeah, so Midwest off-price discount retailer. For those of you that aren't familiar, think of a Burlington, very similar to a Burlington, very similar clientele, very similar demographic neighborhoods that they were showing up in. There was also a furniture element on the furniture side, but we were in the department store. What was different there, we didn't have nearly the same size staff, but the internal theft policies were a little bit more laxed. We could do exploratory interviews, right? We could do first, as soon as you see somebody or assume that they're doing something, you could bring them in and have that discussion with them. And then I started to realize, okay, there's a lot more to this internal thing. First of all, the interview itself, but the preparation for the interview, right? So let me ask you a question. You get a tip. This is putting you back into 1999. You get a tip, or you get a gut feeling about somebody and you find out that yesterday they did something. Okay, they did whatever it is, refund fraud or cash out of the drawer. What was your first question to determine what to do next?
I guess I'd probably have to say, how long have they been there? Would probably be one of the first things. Yeah,
that's it.
Because if they're a newer employee and they hadn't been there that long, I don't know that I would have spent a lot of. But if there's somebody who'd been there for heck a year or two, I mean, clearly, yeah, I would say length of employment is probably one of the first.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's the same with me. And it's interesting you say that, because there's a lot of different philosophies now. And we'll get into that a little bit, because a lot of folks, especially in our solution provider role, we're hearing folks ask for real-time exception-based reporting. And that makes no sense to me. Why would you ever want that? I mean, yeah, it's nice to know that 2 minutes ago somebody did a refund fraud, but am I going to go out and grab them right then and there? More often than not, no.
And I think maybe part of that is that, obviously you've got the internal theft piece, but you've also got, mistakes that are made, right? So to your point, if it's an internal theft and it happened, 20 minutes ago or whatever, then to your point, I wouldn't address it then anyway. I would still have to do back research before I addressed it with that person. Sure. I'm not going to pull them from the floor at that moment with no other information. But if it's somebody did something else, like somebody, rang up an item taxable instead of doing the price modify or something, so now they're selling it at a different price than what we own it at or something, like I could see that instantaneous, in my opinion, to be more of correcting operational behavior, which by the way, I think also could be a deterrent to internal theft, right? Because then they know that you're if you're right on it and you go up to somebody and, hey, you shouldn't have run that taxable, you have to ring it up the right price and price modify. Well, then obviously now me as an employee, I'm going to know that somebody's watching that, so I might be less likely. But I agree with you from a theft standpoint. I wouldn't address it. I think that most folks want that more from a correcting behavior type standpoint, not necessarily someone outright stole.
Well, let's talk about the evolution of the data that was available to us and how we were able to do that research, right? Because that ultimately is how I ended up with the mindset that I have today. And I'm still curious where you split off from the pack. So we already talked about in the original, our first days of looking at internals, we were spending time looking at journal rolls, going up into the attic and pulling the bag. Because at the end of the day, they would pull the journal rolls out, they'd put a rubber band around it, throw it in a bag, write the date on the outside of the bag, and then up into the attic it went. And we would have to go up there, dig through, right? Yeah. And it was find the transaction that's in question, paperclip, go over to the Xerox machine, make a copy on the Xerox machine, and there's your evidence, right?
Yes.
Then came the electronic journal, which I thought was the greatest thing I'd ever seen. You couldn't go, there was no remote access, so I still had to drive to the store,
Right.
but I could see everything electronically, right? So now I go to HR and I say, how long has this person been working here? And I can go back, I think it was 90 days was all we were able to hold on to at that time, but I could go back a full 90 days and find out how long they've been doing it. And then I could make an assumption that if the pattern was still really strong at the beginning of that 90 days, they must have been doing it before then. And that helped me with my interview. So I learned quickly that the more information I had going into the interview, obviously the more confident that I would be in the interview and the more confidence I could project. It goes without saying.
Sure. Of course. Yeah.
Did you experience that shift when the data became more available?
I mean, maybe a little bit. Obviously, I was, it was great. All the different advancements that came. The electronic journal, to your point, was awesome. Some of the data that, again, it came quick too, right? It was like year after year. It was like light years. It felt like you were moving forward and you had all this additional information. And so, there was some of that came about. And I was very much, again, at that time, over the course of years at a few different companies, had actually made my way back to Detroit. I actually worked for an airport retailer that also had no exception-based reporting. The exception-based reporting there was interesting because take like a news magazine stand, right? And you knew that on any given day, like how many travelers were flying out of that terminal, so you could predict what your sales should be, right, for that terminal. So you could actually take and see internal theft by looking at the drop in sales when a certain individual would work at a certain terminal. Like I'll never forget, I had one, this is actually at Detroit Metro Airport, Terminal A. And so if I was suspicious of someone, I would have them assigned to that particular stand because I knew on any given day what the average sales volume should be. And I could see just by the massive, remember it's airports, this is back before credit cards weren't as common, people paid cash, they're always in a hurry, they drop their money and go, etc. And so it wasn't the exception-based reporting was basically just looking at the drop in sales in that terminal when so-and-so worked in that terminal. But as far as the reporting goes, it was probably at the same company you and I both worked at where I really saw some of the additional information. And I know you were a part of that actually at the time, that team that put all that together. And that was, oh my God, that was eye-opening. The amount of data that we had was insane.
Well, let me back you up a little bit because we're getting to that point in the conversation, I think. We talked about the electronic journal. Then the electronic journal went online and you could access it remotely, which was even better. But you still had to search, right? You still had to go. What was your first experience with exception-based reporting? Like, you don't have to mention the platform, but how was it introduced to you, and what did you think of it? And
I couldn't mention the platform because I don't remember the platform, but I think it was very very specific to certain things. It'd be like so-and-so, has high refunds as an example, or so-and-so has, it wasn't very sophisticated. It was just specific data points that identified that there might be something wrong because of just the volume of certain activity on the register. We'll call it that. That's all it was really at the time.
Okay. So you're looking for stuff. And I had a similar experience, right? It was introduced as, look, this is the miracle maker. And honestly, when I saw it demoed, I was like, oh my God, bad guys have no chance. We're going to take out every bad guy that's ever existed, and it's going to be Minority Report. As soon as somebody thinks about stealing, we're going to take them out before they even do it, right?
Yes.
Didn't quite work out that way, but it was really cool. So we start taking out bad guys, right? You and I would both jump on the exception-based reporting. We use it, we leverage it, we use our interviewing skills. We're honed up, we're ready to go. I can't emphasize this enough. In school, math, my worst subject. Despise it. Hate numbers. Hate graphs. Hate Excel. Don't like any of that stuff. And somehow I'm in the data world and passionate about it, right? So I start to notice, first of all, there's a hierarchy to internal theft cases, right? And we didn't talk about this. We talked about being a cowboy for externals, but there's a lot of opinions out there, especially during that time, about what was a good internal case, what you
Right.
could be ridiculed for, what you could be fired for. And I think a lot of that had to do with data, right? So it was always considered a good case if it impacted shrink, because we were
Right. That's what you
reviewed
judge
on
by.
shrink.
Yeah,
But for
absolutely.
some reason, coupon cases and discount cases, and we didn't really have loyalty programs back then, but margin issue cases were poo-pooed. What the hell's that? These are perfectly legitimate. This is a loss to the company. And I
Yeah.
would get reamed.
Yeah, I ironically enough, I actually was probably one of the one poo-poo in those cases, and I think that's because I looked at it as being almost obviously now looking back on it now, I know obviously there was certainly profit implications
Do you
there,
though?
but no, I do. Yeah, if I really look at it,
Of
but no,
course.
I think that I was one of those because I looked at that like, okay, is that really a case? Like, again, it's a competitive thing too, right? At the time, I was always, I was always very good at internals, so quote unquote good, meaning that I would have a lot of them, right? So I was always in the top hierarchy for the companies that I worked at in getting internal cases, and I always looked at coupons as like being like, well, that's a kind of like a cheat. Oh, come on, like that's not. It's not like the person took something or whatever. And I had bosses that worked for me. So one of them I actually still talk to, and he used to say that, well, if they're doing that, they're doing other things. And I would always argue like, nah, I don't know, because if I'm doing that,
And getting
then
away with it.
I'm justifying it in my own mind, right? So it's not really theft. So it doesn't mean they're doing something else. But I was probably one of the one. I'm not probably. I was one of the ones. I was one of the ones who was poo pooing the coupons and stuff like that. Absolutely,
I'm
yes.
glad you admitted that, because I was going to call you on it, because I've
You,
heard
you
things
knew
from
the
you.
answer. You knew the answer already, anyway.
So here's the conundrum, though.
Yeah.
So you find these issues, you can't take them out because you'll get the ridicule, right? And you
Right.
discover maybe they're not always intentional theft issues, because there's so
Right.
much, there's this generational training, right? Where you're basically making a copy of a copy of a copy, and bad habits get passed down from generation to
Of course.
generation.
Yeah.
So it's all mistakes. A lot of it's mistakes.
Right.
And I found that I would try and, for two reasons, right? First of all, because I cared about margin, even though I didn't have to, but I also wanted to clean up my data, because I knew that this person was rising to the top every time, and it was camouflaging the people that were really stealing.
Right.
So I would I would put a report together, and I would send it over to my operating partner and say, here, not an LP issue, not shrink, but we're losing money, whether intentional or not. Can you handle this? And I didn't have the influence at that time to be able to encourage them to do something about it. So it was like sending stuff into the black hole. And I was basically told, stay in your lane. Did you have a similar experience?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was yeah. I've definitely had that happen before in my career. I think most people who've been in LP for any length of time have had that very line used on them. Of course, at
Yeah.
some point in time, yeah.
So then I spent 7 years just dealing with that and getting a really negative feeling about dealing with these margin cases. So to come to where everything started to happen, I get a call from a recruiter saying that CVS is looking to build a team. I think it's okay to mention CVS because we don't have anything negative to say. It was a great experience for me. Formed my entire career.
Yeah.
They were forming a data team, and the data team was going to be focusing in on internal theft cases, but they were also going to be looking at data in a very different way. That's how it was described to me. So I go, okay. So I go through a couple interviews. They flew me out to Woonsocket, and I talked to the folks that were running it. And they were asking me about how I interview and how I research. And then they started talking to me about, well, what do you do if it's not a shrink issue? What do you do if it's a margin issue? What do you do if it looks like this? And I'm going, wow, these guys are asking me questions about things I've been begging people to pay attention to. Completely changed my life. We started looking at things, sales reducing activities. That was burned into my brain. And we were told, all you have to do is mitigate these sales reducing activities, and it's going to drive operational performance, and it's going to improve shrink, and it's going to improve margin. I'm going, there's no way. There's no way by focusing on this cashier that's doing line voids and price modifications. There's no way that's going to impact the bottom line. I'm assuming you had a similar experience because I know it was forced down your throat too.
Yeah, no, it definitely was, and obviously we worked at CVS together for a time, and it certainly was, and obviously again to your point earlier, way early in this conversation about the impact, and so you could see the impact of what that had, and I bought into it, and I was all in, and again,
Did you buy in right away?
no, I mean maybe not right away. I think all of us were skeptical initially. But it didn't take long. I mean, once I saw the numbers and I could see, and then obviously use that, and then again still was able to put the piece of the puzzle together and do the interview and all those other things, and then I could see the impact, and so I bought into it relatively quickly. I think for the most part, but maybe quicker than others, and was very much into that, and then as you know relocated with CVS. But what was interesting is that it wasn't long thereafter that is when I actually got brought into something else, right, which is the organized retail crime piece, which changed the way I look at things.
I
right?
actually don't know the story. How did that happen?
So I'd relocated to Houston, and of course I was focused on all the things that you just mentioned, right? We were looking at data, and we're identifying, internal cases, and we had a lot of them, right? We were doing training classes with store managers on how to identify things, and it was mainly internal. And by this point, the pie chart you mentioned earlier had shifted a little bit, right? So like the operational piece was a much bigger piece of the pie. Internal was a huge piece of the pie, but the external, well, it was pretty small. I mean, maybe I think it was like 25%.
25%. Yeah, that's the one I grew up with.
And I actually had store managers in Houston complaining to me about shoplifting. And I'll never forget, I was in a training class and they were complaining to me about shoplifting. And I remember to this day, I was like, guys, come on. I'm from Detroit, okay? You don't know what shoplifting is, right? Like, it is not that bad, right? And so I'm trying to tell them it's not that bad. I'm trying to get them psyched about, all this other stuff. And you've got to follow, do all these things. And I mean, I believed it at the time. I was passionate about what I was telling them. And then I started, obviously I just moved. I was just in the market, and I started going to stores, and then I started seeing these videos of these individuals, these groups just cleaning out, not like shoplifting, but just grand theft. I mean, like taking like $1,000 in over-the-counter medications, $2,000 in cosmetics, and
Let me pause you real quick, because we grew up there was amateur shoplifters and there was professional shoplifters, right? Professional didn't mean they were good at it. It just meant they made their living by it. And they would go down and sell to a fencing operation. And I don't know when it happened, and maybe you can tell me because you're more of a historian on this, but it seemed like the moment we came up with the word organized retail crime, maybe it was the advent of the internet and people were able to communicate with each other better. But holy shit, Tony, it went from some folks just stealing a bunch of expensive, and doing some expensive refund fraud to doing what you're talking about. Giant epic networks.
Yeah, no. Well, what's interesting is to your point, it's always existed, to be clear, right? And we know that now. You can look back on it. I mean, the first shoplifter I had, right? I mean, he grabbed like 6 or 7 winter coats, all the same size. They clearly weren't for him, right? He was going to resell them. So by pure definition, he was a professional shoplifter or booster, right? But at the time, we didn't call it that. It wasn't until I moved to Houston, I want to say it was 2004. So this is probably like 2004, maybe early 2005, when I'm hearing all these things about these groups. And again, not groups now, not individuals, but groups. And then I start seeing these videos of these groups and just the magnitude of what they were taking. And how much and how often they would hit. I mean, they would go from store to store and they would hit, 10,
That's
15
a big dog,
stores in the same day. Oh, sorry. You can hear that?
That's a big old dog.
My normal speaker, you can't hear that. So, yeah, he's German Shepherd. Yeah, of course. Yep, still loud. Maybe somebody's coming to the door. They shouldn't do that.
Amazon.
Yeah. Well, probably it's probably the case. My wife's on it all the time. Anyway, so no, it was interesting because again, I firmly believed that it was all internal and operational. External was just a minor piece. Then my mindset completely changed because I saw how significant that was and the amount of product they were able to take. And at the time, I remember bringing it up, and even I was poo-pooed, right? Like, oh my God, you're exaggerating, Tony. Like, it's not that bad. External's not that bad. And I'm like, And I started like having to show videos of like the entire over the counter section was just empty, right? Like all the allergy medications,
It's
all
hard to
the
watch too, man.
yeah.
It's
Oh
hard to
yeah.
watch.
Yeah, I think my dog's just going to continue to interrupt us at this point. Maybe he's just doing it out of spite. I'm not really sure. But anyway, no, it was very much it was very eye opening for me. And I think at that point, it's interesting because you mentioned the whole data piece, and that's how you kind of dove down went down that road. And for me, I'm not disputing the data. Obviously, I knew it was important, but when I saw the sheer magnitude of this external piece, it really opened my eyes to the how much could be taken and how much of an impact that has. Because as you know, right, you're a data guy, you know this. It's not just that they're taking that; it's that now the legitimate customer comes in and can't buy it because it's not there, right? And then of course, if nobody's the better ones, the really good folk, the professional shoplifters, right? People don't even know they were there. So then nobody knows they're there. Nobody's scanning the fact that we don't have the product, right? Yeah. So that means we're not getting new product. So it affects so many other things, out of stock. It affects, sales, because the product's not there, and then it may not come right away because they don't even know it's not there. And so there's all the other, and then obviously the unsafe stores and innocent bystanders, being pushed over, and it really like that. It was around late 2004, 2005 where that was where my career started focusing mainly right on that type of activity, where I know you obviously went down a different path, and I think that's why.
But almost not. So I joined CBS early 06, and you may not know this, but you almost got me, and it was you. So I'm learning the data, and
almost got you as in almost caught you. What were you doing, Johnny?
You almost got me onto your philosophy. So okay. I was hesitant to do the sales reducing activity thing, and I didn't believe in it. It didn't. I couldn't wrap my head around it. So I'm kind of in flux, right? I'm on this data team, and at that time we were trying to mitigate SRAs with an Excel spreadsheet, looking at frequency. It was really we knew we had to minimize it, but we didn't know how to do it. And that's what, thank goodness over the last 15 years we've perfected that model. Well, we made it better.
Right.
So I couldn't buy in, and we ended up going to a presentation. It was on ORC. Now, I had heard ORC, Larocco at that time. Joe Larocco with NRF at the time was really pushing that term. I had heard it, and I had experienced professional shoplifting, and I won't mention the name of what we used to call it because it's politically incorrect right now, but there was a group of traveling people that we would call by that specific title, very non-PC. But when I thought professional shoplifting, that's what I thought. Somebody comes in, they light one side of the store on fire, and they steal from the other side, right?
Sure, yeah. Or they go to the safe, yeah.
We have this meeting, and this guy, Tony Shepard, is going to put on this meeting. And I'm going, all right, cool. At least we're going to talk about theft and something interesting. And you went in, and you had this, and I don't know if you still have it. I think I still have the deck because you shared it. But you were teaching us about all of the different levels of the fencing operations and how, once you get to level 2 and level 3, they start cleaning the product and repalletizing and then selling it back to the retailer. And I'm going, holy shit, I'm going to be an ORC guy. This is it. This is what I'm doing. It made sense. And I had friends working for other companies that were like working with the FBI down in Florida and doing all kinds. I'm like, this is it. This is my career path. So you inspired me for like 20 minutes.
20 minutes. That's how much I got was 20 minutes, and then it faded.
I'll tell you what happened. Like a couple months later, I got a bonus check. I had never in my life gotten a bonus check up to that point. And we hit our targets from SRAs and all the things that we were incentivized on, and I got 200% of my bonus. And I had never seen a check like that in my entire life.
Well, that'll change your opinion, certainly.
Looking back now, it wasn't that huge, but for me, holy Toledo, I was like, wow, this
23,500 salary was not huge either, but I thought it was too. So there you go.
Indeed. So your presentation still to this day has a tremendous amount of influence on me. Had I not sat through that, I probably would have no belief in the ORC threat at all today. And I do believe it's a threat. I do understand that I've been in stores where there are certain locations that are just getting decimated by this ORC, right? But my issue with ORC is when I'm reading some of these articles, and I'm not going to bring up any retailer name because I don't want to piss anybody off. But my philosophy has always been you want to try and get as much money from every incident that you can, right? And I'd read an article about an ORC case. We just grabbed a $2 million ORC case. I go, wow, $2 million, that's a lot of money. Yeah, 38 retailers were involved, and it took place up and down the East Coast, and 428 stores were involved. And I go, wow, you saved every store $28. Good job. Very close-minded of me, right? Yeah. Not understanding all of the peripheral impacts that that's having on the business. But that's what started to turn me off to it a little bit. But then I get a phone call. They're looking for someone to start up the new LERPnet program. So I jumped over there, not fully understanding the full ramifications of ORC, dealing with a lot of legal departments that didn't want anybody sharing data back then. So ultimately that project didn't work out and I ended up back on the data side. But I want you to know, you almost had me. And I can imagine that with the number of presentations that you did at CVS, you had to influence a lot of the ORC people that are out in the industry today.
Yeah, no, I obviously it was a good opportunity for me to go out and as you know, I was very passionate about the topic. Still am today. Obviously, I'm very excited about a new product line that we have coming here at not new, but call it enhanced product line we have coming at Think LP specifically for this challenge. But no, I was very passionate about it. What I think is ironic actually is that ORC is obviously a major issue, and it's certainly worse now than it was way back then, right? I mean, and there's obvious reasons for that. I think COVID, in my opinion, was a big factor in that, meaning that a lot of people that had never bought stuff online now shopped online, and a lot of product that's stolen ends up online. So again, supply and demand, it makes sense, right? So I think that caused a significant increase. I think that, as you know, there's sometimes violence, involved in some of this activity, which ironically enough, that's from the lower level folks, to be clear, right? The ones that are more sophisticated are less likely to be violent because there's no reason for them to be like that. They'll just move to another store. But I think what's happened though, I feel like, and I'm very passionate about ORC and always will be, but I think that it's one of those things where retail is always like, there's always this one thing that everybody's just so focused on, and sometimes they lose sight of other things. Yeah. And I think that ORC took the vacuum out of the room for years. And I think as an industry, loss prevention, asset protection, I think we've lost sight of some of the other things. I think that in some cases, internal cases are sometimes missed. One perfect example, in my opinion, I was just having this conversation with somebody up in New York last week that's been in the industry a long time as well. We were talking about vendors, and we're talking about vendor stealing. Yeah. And I just don't hear about those. Like we used to be, you'd hear about that a lot. And obviously I'm still in the industry. I've been in it just like you a long time. I talk to a lot of people, and I don't hear about a lot of those cases. And I'm like, and I think that we sometimes get fixated on one thing and we lose sight of others, right? And to me, loss prevention has to be holistic. Like you have to look at all these different things. You can't just go after that one thing, because if you do, you're going to miss these other things. And I know it's a juggling act, but I do feel like we've gone, maybe a little bit too far, right? To where we're so focused on external that maybe we're losing touch with internal. And certainly vendor, because like I said, I don't hear about that a lot anymore at all. And then maybe even operational. Although, again, it depends. I'm not saying all companies, right? Everybody's a little bit different, but that's just my perspective as a whole, is that, sometimes we take our eye off the ball because of, we're focused on one thing and we lose sight of others.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned vendors. We moved from that SRA philosophy, right, where we were really paying attention to everything that was happening at POS. Then we decided maybe we should start focusing our attention on the back of the house. And I'm sure you remember this, right? We spent a lot of time looking at all the warehouse deliveries and making sure that we were getting credit for everything that we were sending out, and looking at coupon reconciliation and chargebacks and all of these different elements. And then we said, what about the vendors, right? Even in the old days, we were doing vendor audits, but I don't think I fully understood what I was actually looking for. Because again, it was me with a clipboard, not me chasing bad guys. So it didn't have my passion. But once I started to understand, holy cow, what some of these vendors are capable of doing, especially once there's been some trust and relationships have been created and the vendors kind of left alone to do their own thing, a lot of times, that creates an environment of temptation. And we all know what temptation does to people.
Yeah, no, actually, one of the largest cases I ever had, with the exception of the ORC cases, because to your point, well, I've certainly had some large ORC cases, although I think that's misconstrued too, and I can see why people, I think there's people sometimes it's elevated a little bit more than it should be. I think sometimes they don't know what the numbers are and they're guesstimating, but one of the largest cases I had that wasn't ORC was actually a vendor case, and it was a dairy case of all things. It was dairy, so like milk and butter and stuff, and
Yeah,
it
milk
ended
guys.
up being, I want to say it was like $1.2 million or something. I'm like, how is that possible? But it was a course of many, many years.
That's a lot of
Uh,
yogurt.
yeah, it's a lot of yogurt, a lot of yogurt. But again, to your point, it's that was a long time ago, and I don't hear about those anymore. So I feel like that's something that's probably a miss.
So once we got done looking at vendors, then we moved into what we called center of house, right? Which was all the stuff on the sales floor. So now we've got data. We're looking at markdowns and markups and pricing, and inventory growth. And inventory growth was where things started to get real, right? Because when we started to look at root causation of inventory growth, I had some overlap with you and your team, right? Because a
Oh
lot of
yeah,
it was
no,
ORC
yeah.
related.
You can't. The stores are only so big. I remember that some of those reports. You see this inventory growth, and be like, well, they can't possibly be in the store because there's not enough room to keep it there.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. And then you get to the root causation, right? And it's a vendor's overcharging you and adding to your inventory. You've got refund fraud happening. You've got somebody coming in and wiping out all of your tide every other day. And it was a really good mechanism for us to determine shrink. Now, I know a lot of companies will actually look at cycle counts as a good predictor of shrink, and it is. But I like to look even deeper and see, okay, when do those cycle counts happen? Did they all happen at once? Were they spread out evenly? Every week you got to do the same one. That's organized retail crime right there. But what it allowed, Tony, now we've got visibility to the entire store. I can see the product from the time it arrives to the store all the way through the time it leaves with the customer's hand. And I can see when things are going wrong. And we start to send that reporting out, right? And our loss prevention team at that point was trained. Look, you have the ability to have influence over the store operations. I don't know if it was because we didn't have that many field managers or what, or if people better than me created that type of rapport with the operators, but we were able to drive dramatic savings through the data. And while I respected and understood everything that the ORC team was doing, for me, I felt like I could make so much more impact and see a tangible dollar amount, right? When you look at ORC or any theft for that matter, it's hard to say this is a definitive bottom line impact to the store, right? If you make the apprehension, you stop them, you find out they've been stealing from you for a year, but you only stop them for what they've got right now. How do you recoup all those losses for everything beforehand? And that's where I think
you
that's where
don't.
I live right
Right.
now.
You don't. To be clear, you're not getting that back. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think to your point, John. I think that's where we went down different paths. I think we understand. Like I get obviously what you're talking about, right? I clearly understand, the whole total retail loss philosophy and what goes on in all the operational things that contribute to shrink, and I certainly think that that's important. Obviously, I lived on the side of ORC of my 30 years. I mean, heck, more than half of that was spent in dealing with the external type of crime. I think that I think that's where the challenge is in the industry today, in my opinion, is again, it's that holistic view. How do you focus on all of the things, right? Especially with limited staffs, right? You have limited resources, but your task, you to your point, you've got to improve the numbers. If you're just focused on internal, that's going to be a challenge to do so, right? I mean, it's certainly
Yeah.
the most difficult to control, right? But at the same time, you can't not focus on the external because it's a brand reputation, it's safety of employees and customers. So I think that it is not I'm not saying the jobs were easy back then, but I think in today's world and retail specifically, I think that job to be a leader of a loss prevention or asset protection department in today, it's got to be challenging because you're trying to make an impact on so many things, and you have to hit all the things. You can't all the things you got to focus on, right? You can't just focus on one or two and then let the others go. It's not acceptable
Well,
because
that
it's
raises,
either a profit issue or a safety issue.
but that raises a question, Tony. So I think you're 100% right. Obviously, you've got to have an open mind and an open understanding that all of these things are impacting your organization. But where I'm struggling and where I think the industry is struggling is a lack of uniformal thought, a lack of standardized thought. Now, I know it got a lot better when Loss Prevention Foundation really started to push certification and started to come up with shared language between the different companies, and they're continuing to evolve that today, which is amazing. But we're not moving fast enough. And let me give you a quick example. I truly believe, because I've seen it, if you sit in a room with 20 vice presidents of loss prevention, through no fault of their own, I'm going to add that, okay, through no fault of their own, but if you put 20 loss prevention vice presidents in a room and you ask them to define loss, you're going to get 27 different definitions.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think you're right. I mean, heck, even shrink. Let's just take the one piece, which is shrink. Even that, right? People do it by retail. They do it by cost. How do you compare to others? How do you? And again, that's just one facet of loss. To your point, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of different opinions. Certainly, there's a lot of different answers. Yeah, I mean, I think that to your point, I think we've come a long way, obviously, from an educational standpoint. You mentioned, LPF. You've got the different certifications. You've got the big trade organizations who, by the way, are pushing legislation, right? And another bill was actually just introduced, federal bill related to ORC. Very exciting stuff. Hopefully it'll make it through, but it was introduced, so that's a good sign. And so there's positive. You got Loss Prevention Research Council doing a lot of research things, right, to build on LP and show the, again, that it's backed by research. But to your point, there's still very much differences of opinion, and it's hard. It's hard to come to uniform answers like that because every company's a little bit different. They have different. I mean, heck, even ORC. Right, I remember trying to define what that was. Oh my God, it was
can't get that definition.
trying to define what. First of all, you had some like the FBI. They wouldn't call it organized retail crime. They refused. It was organized retail theft. They would not call it organized retail crime. You had, how do you define it? Well, like again, if you're going to have a law against something, you have to define what something is, right? So there had to be a definition, right? But it was. I remember sitting in those meetings, and what is even now? What is ORC? If somebody comes in and they grab 10 tubes of toothpaste and they sell it across the street, right? Is that organized retail crime? I mean, in theory, because they stole for resale, that they weren't going to use all the toothpaste, right? But is that? Some companies would say yes, that's level one, that's low level ORC. Some companies would say no, that's just repeat offenders. That's it's a challenge.
Well, you could see where they would struggle calling it organized crime, right? I mean, we understood it was organized crime, but the public persona of organized crime is, we've seen the Godfather movies and Goodfellas,
yes.
And that's organized retail crime, all that stereotypical stuff. Not understanding the criminal network that's been developed. The criminals quickly decided that it was a lot better to get caught with $20,000 worth of stolen merchandise than it was to get caught with $20,000 worth of crack cocaine.
Yeah, absolutely.
One's going to get you thrown in the room for the rest of your life. One, you're probably going to get a ticket.
Yeah, no, they definitely learned early on. And to your point, I think that's changed. Certainly, I think that a lot of those big cases you mentioned, I think people got a flavor for the sophistication. Although it's still skewed because again, the media gets a hold of video clips and they show the same one 17 times, and it looks very unorganized and like, oh, this is organized. You're watching it, you could be confused, right, as a viewer, like organized retail crime, and you see people running around just grabbing random things. It's hard to wrap your head around that. Yeah.
So let me run something past you, and I think we're getting to the point of this podcast and what we're looking to explore with some of the folks in the industry. You and I have two not altogether different thought processes. I think we always meet in the middle, right? But we go about it a little bit differently and respect and understand the overlap between our two philosophies. I'm going to pose a question to you and let me get your opinion on this. And we haven't talked about this in advance. So when I talked about the 20 vice presidents giving 27 different definitions through no fault of their own, I really mean that. Do you believe that loss prevention is not something that can ever be standardized, but will only be appropriate retail by retail on a case by case basis? Meaning, what is important to the C suite in this retailer may not necessarily be as important to the C suite at that retailer, and that ultimately influences the decisions that the loss prevention team is going to make?
That's a great question. I think I guess I'm going to say partially yes. And what do I mean by obviously just my opinion? I think that there is more standardization that could be done. I think that there's more. Again, just goes back to the education piece, right? It's more standard. I mean, heck, now they have college courses specifically on loss prevention. So I think that there's some more uniformity to come. However, you're always going to have different priorities depending on the company and depending on who's in the C-suite. You're going to have loss prevention people that have different levels of influence on what that should be. And so I think you're always going to have some variation, but I do think that gradually it will become a little bit more uniform than it is now, but I don't think it'll ever be at the point where it's just you go from one company to the other and you're focused on exactly the same things. I don't think that's reasonable to expect, because there's going to be different challenges at different companies and they're going to be focused on different things. And so, yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question. I would call it maybe a maybe or a partial. Yeah. I don't know what the right answer is, but
I don't know that either one of us.
I'd be interested. I think it's a great question, though, for some of our guests, because I think it'll be interesting to hear their perspective. Because just like you and I have different perspectives, there's a lot of folks out there that have different perspectives than both of us, right? On how this should be, how AP, what AP or LP should be focused on. So it'll be interesting to get their take. I think that's a great question, and thanks for not preparing me in advance for that. I appreciate that.
I guess my point is that we have a lot to learn about everybody's philosophy and why certain things are important to certain people. And I'm guessing that as much as I'd like to be right in our friendly banter, there may not be a right answer other than what your C-suite tells you is the right answer, or what your shareholders tell you is the right answer.
Well, and I think that's the very point. That's kind of what I was trying to say is that we may come together more and agree upon things more as an industry, but at the end of the day, we still have folks that we report to who are going to have a variation of that, meaning it's going to be what they think is the most important. So that's never good. To me, that's never going to go away. So you're never going to get completely there, but I think that, I mean, heck, again, I talked about ORC, right? Organized retail theft. I mean, look how far we've come in that, right? I mean, there's state laws, and I think 37 states now. There's a federal law, the Inform Act, again, the other one that was just introduced. CORCA, I believe, is the abbreviation. But again, we've come a long way. So I think we'll get further along. College courses, like I mentioned, but yeah, there's always going to be others that are, gonna have focused points on things that are the most important to them, that are going to be above, the LP pyramid head in a particular company.
Awesome. Well, if you'll humor me, I have one more question maybe before we wrap up this inaugural episode.
Sure.
There's a lot of territory for us to explore going forward. A lot of things that we've talked about today, a lot of different philosophies. What are the types of guests, not necessarily names, but what are the types of guests that you'd like to ultimately bring onto this podcast that we can pick their brain and learn about their philosophies? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I'd like to have a pretty wide range, right? I was actually, I missed a call recently. I'm not going to call out which organization it was, but I missed a call, and I was just listening to the recording, and someone mentioned the grandfathers of the industry or something to that effect, right? And if I had been on the call, because as you know, I'm a very sarcastic person, I probably would have said, are you talking about me? Is it the white hair, etc.? Although it was a recording, so obviously I could talk to myself, but no one else is going to listen. But at the time, it actually hit me, right? Because I think that, I definitely want to talk to some folks that are some grandfathers or grandmothers of the industry, people that have been around a long time, that have seen the different perspective of different companies, the evolution of the of loss prevention in general, right? So I think that we need to have a lot of those guests. I'd love to get their opinions, and we both know a lot of those folks, so hopefully we'll be able to get them to come on. But I do think I'd really, again, I literally just listened to this recording yesterday, but I think that was a good point, and I think that I'd love to get some folks that are newer to the industry, right? That don't have that background, and get their opinions, because I think those are important. And I do think that to the person that's made the point on that recording, that's a valid point. I think that the industry is, obviously you're going to look to folks that have done things for a long time, and like you pointed out, I've done ORC for a long time. I know that I get asked questions, and I'm always happy to help and answer questions, and I'm very passionate. But again, I don't know. Heck, I've been out of it for 3.5 years in the investigative space, right? I mean, I think that I'd like to get a wide range of folks and get their perspectives. Some folks that are newer, some folks that have been here a long time, folks that have different opinions like us, right? Folks that are more data driven, folks that are more operationally focused, folks that are more focused on the external piece or the internal piece. I'd love to have the conversation about the vendor thing. Like, I don't want to, have to, be clear. Some of these folks, they have their day jobs. We want to get them in trouble, but I'd love to hear what they have to say about some of that, because, again, I'm just curious myself as is that something that's still being addressed. But I think it's important that we get different perspectives, and I'd like to think that's what our whole purpose here is to get that varying perspective. And in order to do that, you're going to have a wide range of guests, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think that it's really important to not only pay respects to the quote unquote grandfathers, and I'm talking maybe one generation before us. As much as I'd like to include us into that legendary group, there's some folks that had so much influence over my career. I don't see myself as their equal. Or at least from an influential standpoint, right? So I'd love to get a couple of those folks, the maybe just retired or maybe just thinking about retiring, and get their perspective not only on where the industry is today, but how we got here and what influenced them to maybe alter their perceptions as they move forward. And do they have recommendations on how we do that going forward, right? And then we have some of the folks today that are still split into a couple of different groups. You still have companies that are very shrink focused and only shrink focused, and that works for them. But then you have some others that are moving into this, what the cool kids today are calling total retail loss philosophy, which is what you and I just call loss prevention a number of years ago. But since that great study came out, it's raised some more eyebrows. So yeah, I want to see that variety too. I'd love to see some leaders from across the industry that have these different mindsets. I'd also like to see some of the analysts and some of the organized retail crime investigators, and learn about what they're dealing with in the trenches. Because to your point, we have been out of it for a little bit, and as much time as we spend with customers, we still can only pick up so much in an hour and a half meeting. We're talking about 15 different topics. So I think with this podcast, it gives us the opportunity to sit folks down and really pick their brain for a half hour, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, and just break down their philosophy and see what we can all benefit from.
Yeah, I agree. And by the way, the folks on the retirement side, I think that'll be interesting conversations, because they also are the ones that can be the most candid during those conversations, right? Because if someone is working for a company, obviously, we both did that for many, many years. You have to, you're not able to be quite as candid maybe as you would want when it comes to certain topics. So I think we're on the same page. I'm excited about this, Johnny. I know that it's our first episode. It's just you and I. Hopefully, it didn't bore the crowd too much. Hopefully, people actually made it to this point and they actually listen to the podcast.
It may just be me and you here, buddy.
Yeah, I'm super excited about it. I was able to finally get all this equipment hooked up. It's funny, I'm at Think LP, as most people know, I'm not a huge tech person, but got it all set up, and it's going to be great. I'm excited about it. I'm excited that our company, Think LP, is thinks it's important enough to have us do this podcast. So certainly appreciate that, and looking forward to our first guest that we'll be having soon.
Me too. Listen, thanks for the time. Thanks for letting me be a part of this. I think we're going to have some fun. And with that, we'll end this episode and look forward to our first guest coming up soon.
All right. Excellent.
Take care, buddy.
All right.
Thanks for listening to It's Your Loss, where we explore the strategies, stories, and data driving the future of loss prevention. This podcast is brought to you by ThinkLP, powering loss prevention for over 200 leading retailers and helping protect people and profits around the world. If you got value from today's episode, make sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube so you never miss an update. Let's keep the conversation going. Follow Tony Shepard and Johnny Custer on LinkedIn for more insights, stories from the field, and industry updates between episodes. We'll be back soon with more news, more strategy, and yes, probably another crazy loss prevention story or two. Until then, keep protecting people, securing profits, and try not to let it be your loss.